First, let's discuss the colored pieces. These four are the colored pieces of the hat's outer and inner fabrics. I use the same fabric for both the outer and inner layers of the hat, because this fabric is relatively thin. If the outer fabric you are using is thicker, then you can choose a thinner fabric for your lining. When drawing, you draw by flipping it from side to side. The top position has a marking point that needs to be highlighted. Be aware that both the lining and the outer fabric should use knitted fabric. Next is the part inside the hat. The fabric used for this colorful piece in the hat is the same material. Then we need to be careful not to cut this part. We just need to mark this position. After we finish measuring the outer and inner fabrics, we will then cut this part. There are 2 marking points at the bottom here. They also need to be indicated. The colorful pieces in the center and on the side of the hat are all sewn with a standard 5mm stitch. Then there are 2 sleeves. The sleeves need to be turned inside out and marked on both sides. Then it has one side at the front and one at the back. You can mark the position at the back or the front yourself. I marked the position at the back here. Leave 1 centimeter for sewing at the bottom edge. The remaining positions should normally be 5mm. Then we have 1 front piece and 2 back pieces. For the bottom edge, we need to leave 1 centimeter for sewing. The position of the crotch in the middle of the front, we will cut straight down the middle, like this. The cut should be away from the sewing line at the top. It still appears to be about 4 to 5mm thick. Then there are seams at the openings of the 2 back pieces. Leave 1 centimeter on one side and 1.5 centimeters on the other side. The seams up here we will work on the hat part. The processing method for the hat's outer fabric and the lining is the same. Here I will first use the outer fabric to demonstrate. Regarding the marking point on the side of the hat, you can mark it on the front side of the fabric, because we will be stitching face to face shortly. I place the hat brim underneath. This way, it aligns better. Everyone can do it according to their own preferences. When we start stitching later, the 2 markers in the cap should align with these 2 markers on the side of the cap to be aligned together. Next, we will take one side of the cap and sew it together with the part inside the cap. When sewing, the right sides should face each other. Remember to align the marking points we discussed earlier. After measuring, it looks like this. Then we will take the other side. Sew it together with the other side of the cap. It is also facing forward. Make sure the marked points are aligned. After connecting the center and the 2 sides of the cap, it looks like this. The shape of this cap has already taken form. Then we will sew the seam that we just measured. Spread it apart to both sides. Measure the marked line on the front. Measure 1 line on each side. In other words, measure a marked line on each side of the seam. This way, it can make this position a little flatter. But if the ones measuring the clear lines are not very skilled, you can omit this step. Just use it to smooth things out. After measuring the 4 clear lines, it appears like this. Then we need to outline the hollow part of the hat. Outline this area. First, find the markers in front of us, the positions of these 2 markers. Here we need to pay attention to an issue. If we discuss the positions of these 2 markers, then it signifies lateral deformation. The locations of the 2 markers are not in a parallel condition. Then you should realign this drawing. Mark the position of this marker point. Remark it. After marking the positions of the 2 marker points, next, we will take the midpoint between them. The marker point at the center position. Make it as well. You can measure the distance with a ruler and divide it by 2. Then we will take the hollow positions, fold this blueprint in half. The location of the center point formed by the fold. Align with the position of our target center point. Align the positions on both sides accordingly. The 2 marker points from the beginning, the marker points on both sides. Then we will be at this position. Trace the pattern. Be sure to pay attention when tracing the image. The fabric underneath should be laid as flat as possible. Be sure to check it after tracing. Check whether this position is skewed. If it's crooked, you'll need to adjust it yourself. Then here I'm using a thin weighing scale. If you don't have a thin weighing scale, you can also skip it. Then you can just use a piece of it. For example, 60 thread cotton fabric. It's the standard type. Non-stretch lining fabric is also fine. I suggest you review this step. After reviewing everything, you all should decide what to use. Because if there is no steam press, I think it would be fine to use ordinary fabric instead. Is also acceptable, but do not use knit fabric, because our hats are made of knitted fabric. Then if you use knitted fabric for this part, it means that the whole thing can easily deform. This hole may get bigger and bigger. And also, my heat press is relatively transparent. If the fabric you're using is relatively opaque, then you should draw on the back of this hat at this hollow position. Try not to draw on another piece of fabric. Regarding the other piece of fabric, I'm worried that your position might not be correct. If you draw this directly on the hat, it's more precise when we stitch it. If you're using a heat scale like I do, it has 1 rough side and 1 smooth side. I use the smooth side as the front. Then position it opposite the front of the hat, directly following what we just drew. Sew in this hollow area. At this time, it is important to pay attention. This hollow area, it should also be made as flat as possible. There's one more thing to keep in mind. The fabric layer on top. You should be at least a bit larger than the hollow space below. A circumference that's about 2 centimeters larger. A slightly larger size would be more appropriate. We'll turn it over shortly. The excess will be handled later. We can just trim it off again. Let's take a look after the car is ready. The back side looks like this. You can see the stitching around here, and the front side looks like this. Then we need to cut open this position. Cut around, leaving about a 5 mm seam. Make some cuts in the curved areas, cut straight in, but be careful, do not cut into the seam line. Then we will take this layer of fabric, turn it over to the other side. Use a pressing tool to smooth the edges once it is smoothed out. Let's trim this excess part a little more. I'm leaving approximately 1 centimeter here. If you're using a heat scale like I do, we'll press the edges with an edge presser as well to attach this fabric to the heat scale. I believe this step highlights one of the advantages of using a hot scale because it can adhere to the fabric itself. If you are using other materials, such as high-quality cotton, to manage this step, then use a pearl needle or similar tools. Fix it like this. After it's ironed, it will stick together like this. This part will be relatively flatter. Then we repeat the steps. Handle the gift fabric in the same way. After the tablecloth and ceremonial cloth are ready, we should compare them now. It's to check whether the positions of these two openings are the same. If there's too much difference, you might need to do it again by yourself, I think. If it's just a minor error, it's not a problem, because normally in this kind of manual operation, there is bound to be a minor error. Then at the bottom of the central piece, we need to add a disc in. I'm using this type of finished buckle plate, or you can use elastic bands, or the method of hand sewing buckle plates. Actually, all of these are acceptable, as long as there's a spot like this to hook the buckle. The position of the piece in our drawing, isn't there one like this at the bottom here? A relatively large dot. This is our position. We need to measure from the front when we measure, but I'm currently on the reverse side. Let me demonstrate this position to you. It's right at this spot, next to my left fingernail. This design is measured along the line. It's the same position. We measured it on the front side of the fabric. After measuring, the front side looks like this, the back side looks like this. Then I use this type of buckle plate. It has a relatively large area in this design position. It can be trimmed a bit, because this area is too large. If we don't trim it, just a moment, we will measure this. Regarding the line next to it, being too close to it will definitely result in a measurement. When measuring the line beside it, you cannot measure this one on this side, this style of the disc holder. Otherwise, you won't be able to turn it over later. If it's a hand-sewn button plate, you can wait for the finished product. Then you can sew this spot. Now, if it's this type of button plate, you need to sew it ahead of time. Confirm that there are no issues. We will place the two hats facing each other, especially at the hollow areas of the two hats. Make sure to align them. You can secure it yourself using clips or pins. First, let's sew the previous line to ensure it is aligned vertically. The position of the stitching style encountered during the sewing measurement process. Everything must be aligned. After finishing sewing this line at the front, we'll sew it again. This is the location of the slit in the back middle piece. After measuring and stitching this area, it should look like this. Then we cut along the middle. You need to be a bit careful. Make sure not to cut into our seam. Cut straight inwards from the center, from the position of the top stitch, approximately 1 to 2 millimeters. It shouldn't be too far off if it's too far away. The position at the top. This side won't be smooth when flipped. The clip or pin fixed at the front, you can remove it first. Then we will start from this position on the bottom edge. Turn the entire hat to the front. After flipping it over, our outer and inner parts face each other. First, tidy up the opening and button on the back. Move the edge inwards to a clear line of 1 millimeter. Make it a little smoother. If you don't like measuring the reference line, you can just iron it flat. When measuring the reference line, the front of our watch is facing up. After measuring, it looks like this. Relatively speaking, this position will be more even. Then we touch it with our hands. You might feel the seam in this area next to it. It seems to be thicker. We can flip it over, put this area next to it inside, sew this one inside. This position can be trimmed a little. The stitching at this position. This refers to the crown and the sides of our hat. This refers to the stitching done during assembly. Be careful while trimming. Make sure not to cut through the fabric itself. Once the trimming is done, we just need to flip it back. This spot on the other side. The same method applies here. Then we'll address this position in front. Let's also organize it a bit. Measure a 5 millimeters line inward from the edge. I have already measured it here. This side is a channel. Wait a moment. We will string the cotton thread before threading the cotton string. First, we align this hollow position with the inner and outer parts aligned. Then we draw a line along the edge to secure it. Once secured, it looks like this. Then let's mark here. We need to stitch the front and back pieces along with the sleeves. If a fabric label is needed, you can attach the fabric label to the main fabric in advance, as I do. If you don't need to add it, feel free to ignore this. Please note that the fabric label is applied to the front side of the main fabric. Just wait a moment. Once we're done, the front will look like this. This part in the middle is the front piece. Next, we have 2 sleeves. The front positions of the 2 sleeves align with the front piece. Just wait a moment. We will sew this edge to that edge. These 2 edges are stitched together. Then there are 2 back pieces. This position is stitched together. This position on this side is stitched together. Here I will stitch from right to left, piece by piece. When sewing, we should ensure that the fronts are aligned. This is how it looks after sewing the back piece and sleeve together. Next, we will attach the other side of the sleeve to the front piece. Likewise, the fronts should be aligned. Sew the side seams along the top and bottom edges. These 3 parts, when sewn together and unfolded, look like this. Then we sew the sleeve on the other side to this part of the front piece together. After all 4 parts are sewn together, it looks like this when unfolded. Then we sew this position of the last back piece to the sleeve. It should also be facing front to front. After all 5 parts are stitched together, it looks like this. Then there are 4 stitching positions. This stitching can be separated to either side. Shift each side of the front to the marked line. On each side of the stitching, move towards. This is how all 4 marked positions look after completing the side seams. Then, we will fold the bottom edge of the sleeve position on both sides following the seam line. The edge is moved inward to the 4mm line. In a moment, we will loosen the elastic band at this point. Just a heads up, you can also skip loosening the elastic band here. Relaxing the elastic band will create a gathering effect. If the elastic band is not relaxed, it will feel like a typical t-shirt cuff. I made 2 finished sets, one of which has a relaxed elastic band. One set does not have a relaxed elastic band. You can take a look at the finished product images. Because the bottom edge has a slight curve, it's difficult to fold. So we can mark the position of the bottom edge on the front of this fabric. Draw the sewing line at the bottom edge position first. The line is visible from the front. Then when we fold it to the back, it will be easier. This is how it looks after the lines on both sides are folded. If you don't loosen the elastic band, just move on to the next step. Now let's address the opening at the back. First, let's examine the opening at the back. The seams on each side are different. One side is wide, while the other is narrow. Then we have marking points at this location. Mark the marker point at this location. This is our cutoff point. Then we need to align the sewing positions of these 2 pieces. Pay attention to the positions of these 2 lines. Make the positions of these 2 lines face each other. We will sew down from the end point. After sewing, we will open this seam to both sides. Now we can see what we are discussing. This seam is also wider on one side and narrower on the other. First, we will deal with the narrower seam. Just follow this sewing line directly. Fold it over to its own side like this. Directly fold a line to secure this position. Once secured, it looks like this. The line is folded about 4 to 5 millimeters in from the edge. Then we will deal with this wider seam. First, let's look at the seam line next to it, which is in this position. The edge of our fabric aligns with this seam line. Fold it over like this. It's different from the other side. The other side is fully folded. Here, we align with the edge of the fabric, align with this sewn fold. This wider seam measures 1.5 centimeters. This means we folded it at the 0.75 centimeter mark. Then we pinch the folded section. Fold a line separately to secure it. Don't fold it in other areas. We only fold along this seam. Fold it about 4 to 5 millimeters from the edge. It looks like this after folding. Next, we unfold the 2 back pieces. Sew the wider piece. Sew the narrower piece like this, flipped over, let them overlap together, then keep this position. We turn it to the front. You can see that there is an amount of overlap here. This is our fastening point. If you turn it over, there is no overlap. Then you must have made a mistake again. It is certain that there is an overlapping amount. We are at this position at the cutoff point. Just fold a line like this shortly, because if you often wear and remove it, if you don't bend the line at this position, secure it a bit. The line here can easily come undone. The original line can easily unravel. Make sure after handling the opening at the back, let's take a look. It's this position at the very top. We need to work with the opening at the back of the hat. Sew them together. The position at the edge of the split on the left side. Align with the edge position below. Of course, we will align face to face later. Now I'm just comparing this position with you. Then we will first set the buckle position. Place it flat like this. Mark this position at the top edge. Make a mark on the fabric below. The edge of this position at the slit on the other side. Just align with this marked point. We will officially measure the seam later. The front of the hat is aligned with the front of the fabric underneath. That means this side on the left is aligned with this section underneath. The position of the opening is perfectly aligned. The outer edges are aligned. Then, regarding this side on the right, it is just aligned with the marked point. Next, let's work on the marked points in front. At the neckline position at the top of this front piece, fold it in half to find the center point and mark it. Then we take this marked point as the reference. Mark 3 millimeters to its left and make a mark 3 millimeters to the right. Then take out our hat. The bottom edge of the hat and the collar must be sewn together. Starting position. This is the leftmost marker point we just created. That is the topmost marker point currently in the video. This is oriented towards the front. We will sew around the neckline and measure the stitching. When we reach the end position during measurement, the edge of the top of our hat and the edge of the opening at the back below are perfectly aligned. If you are not very confident, ladies, you can use bamboo needles or clips to secure it in advance. Remeasure the seam. After measuring the seam here, we will then work on the other side of the hat split. At the edge, align the position of our marked point, the location of the marking point on the back. Begin measuring the seam from this point. It is also aligned with the front. Measure the seam line from top to bottom. Be attentive when measuring to the end point. This is the final position where it ends. It should be aligned with the one we created earlier, the rightmost marker of the 3 markers. You can ignore the middle marker. The middle marker, it's only for comparison at this position. After the test, we'll take a look. The position of the collar in the front. It crosses over on both sides. There is no gap in the center. It's not that both sides simply merge perfectly. There is a point where they intersect and overlap. Now, let's examine the opening at the back here. On this left side, it aligns perfectly with the edge below. Then on the right side is this edge position. is this edge position. Align to about 7 millimeters inward. The measurement is fine. We will take the sewing position we just discussed, fold it down like this. Sew a line around the entire neckline. Note that when we sew the line, all the sewing underneath is directed to the left. Sewing on your own, while checking if the position underneath is correct. After sewing the neckline with the marking thread, it turns out like this. Now let's unfold the front and back pieces like this. This is the back piece. This is the front piece. The sides are the sleeves. They are facing up. Now we will stack the front and back pieces, like this, with the front sides facing each other. We are going to sew the side seams of the front and back panels and the side seams of the sleeves. Sew continuously like this. After sewing, make a few notches at the underarm area. The position of the double neck strap. If you feel there are too many stitches here, you can also trim it a bit, leave about 3 millimeters. Then we can sew it back together at the same position on the other side. Tap the underarm area to lessen the seam. Next, we will turn the entire garment to the front. Turn the sleeves over like this. Here we need to address the hem on both sides. First, we will split the seam in the middle towards both sides. Then fold along this line to make an inner stitch. After folding, move to the line. Then wear the double neck strap. The process for this cuff is the same. Everyone can repeat this step on their own. The two pant openings are put on correctly. The double neck strap looks like this. Then we turn the entire
Finally, let's take a look at this button on the back. It's right at this position above. I sewed a button at this spot. Regarding this button, it's related to the size of your button disc. If your button plate is relatively small, then you should sew the button a bit smaller. My button plate is relatively large, so I also used a slightly larger button. This one is probably about an 8 millimeters button. Then there's the position of this buttonhole below. We'll sew on 2 hidden buttons. Now let's discuss how to wear this garment. When we put it on, we go in from this position. First, make sure your feet are positioned correctly. Then put your hand in this spot. Finally, pull this hat up from the back. Gently press your ears down. Once it's on, adjust it a bit. Button up this part at the back. This is how it looks once everything is secured. The front section of this cap strap, you can adjust.
Let me explain this position regarding the disc in detail. For instance, this piece here is a fabric. Of course, this is paper. I'm just showing how this method works. Then we need to make a cut on the front side of the fabric. This position is for placing the buckle plate. If it's a buckle plate, it definitely has a ring. The circular part should be oriented to the left. Be sure to note that this is the front side of the fabric. We will align it with the front side like this. Position it well. We will secure it with a few stitches at this position. Then after securing it, you will find that the stitching position is quite long. If it is relatively long, hold on, as we still need to face each other. To sew the opening at this position, on the other side, you will stitch this seam. Wait a moment. Flipping it won't fit anymore. So we need to trim this overly long seam slightly, because the current position I've drawn is relatively wide.